Episode 116. 5 Arguments Christians Should Forget. This is Matthew, and in this episode I'll be picking apart an episode of the Apologetics 365 podcast from May 2022. See links at 1. In the episode, Brian Auten and Chad Gross discuss 5 arguments they think every Christian should know. So I'll be explaining why they are bullshit and why they should not convince you to take Christianity seriously. The arguments covered are cosmological arguments, design arguments, moral arguments, resurrection arguments, New Testament arguments, and the argument against religious pluralism. Phew! Here is the first argument that they discuss.
I think you have to start with why religious pluralism is false.
See link 2 for the Wikipedia article on religious pluralism. In this discussion, Brian and Chad don't mean the cohabitation of multiple religions. They mean the position that they're all true. I'm not sure religious pluralism actually means that, but that is a position they are attacking in this discussion. It's an easy target to hit because all religions have differences, and some of those differences are contradictory. Therefore, they can't all be true. Nothing controversial there. However, the conclusion they want to get to is that Christianity alone is the true one. But this argument doesn't get you there. What this argument does is create doubt over all religions. So if a Christian pushes this argument, remind them that their religion is one in a big pile of religions which thinks that it is true while all the others think it is false.
And the reason I picked that is because so much of the sentiment here in the area I live in, and I don't know how much this is true of the United States, is just all religions are the same. And that you really can't even parse out which, certain ones are true and certain ones are false, or one is more true than the other. They're not even thought about in that way.
Yeah.
And so I think for me, it's important to point out, this idea that all religions can be true or all religions are equally valid. All religions are basically trying to teach the same thing. That has to be demonstrated to be false. And I think that's kind of laying the ground there. So that's my first one is
That's good.
Why religious pluralism is false.
Another point to consider with this argument is the many flavours of Christianity. Some Christian sects have beliefs that contradict with other Christian sects. So anyone who argues for the truth of Christianity needs to deal with the awkward question of which version. Don't let them dodge this. The many variants of Christianity must mean that most Christians are wrong. But let's push that further. It's almost certain that there is not a single Christian who has all the right beliefs and none of the wrong beliefs. Every Christian will believe something that is wrong. Therefore, they cannot tell me what the right version of Christianity is. Their obvious comeback will be that their God is gracious and will be lenient so long as you have the right core belief of Jesus as your saviour. The answer to that is that we have no way of knowing if that really is a correct belief, and that is why this argument should have zero impact.
Secondly is the Kalam cosmological argument. I was more specific, and I would be happy to talk about why I didn't pick the one that I know you like most, and we'll get into that more as we unpack them.
Ugh. Do not be taken in by this wretched mess. The Kalam is described at link 3, and link 4 is to a video by atheist YouTuber Skydivephil critiquing the Kalam. They will return to this and the other arguments later, so I'll give specific responses as they give more detail.
My third one was the fine-tuning argument.
And it's a very problematic argument due to the utter lack of specificity. I'll critique the detail of what they say as they say it.
Fourth one was a moral argument. I have kind of 2 different versions, and it just depends on the length of conversation that you're having, and it depends on how familiar the person is with the arguments as to which one you would use.
You'd think that Christians being immoral would, bury this one, but apparently not.
And then finally, mine is a resurrection argument.
Interesting that the resurrection is reduced to an argument. If the resurrection really was the historical event that Christians claim it to be, you'd think there'd be some great evidence for it. But nope. They have to dig out the crowbar and heave a few arguments around it to support their belief. That's why Christianity will always be a religion and never a fact.
Do I want to say reliability of the New Testament so you can make a resurrection argument? And I thought, but that's technically two different arguments, you know? Mm-hmm. And so I included the resurrection but if I had another argument to add on, I would want to argue for the reliability of the New Testament.
The alleged reliability of the New Testament accounts is a drum that apologists love to beat. See link 5 for an article on how Christians argue for this reliability, and 6 for an article on why the New Testament accounts should not be considered reliable historical sources. This is a massive subject, and it will be impossible for me to dig into all the detail here. In summary, one effective way to counter these arguments is to point out that it is impossible to have any confidence in ancient descriptions of one-off events like the miracles of Jesus, especially when they are written many decades later, and that the written accounts we have were not written by those who would have been there to witness it. Additionally, writers at that time would often insert fictionalized account into narratives about real people. Miracles and resurrections are not unique to Jesus. It is also worth pointing out that descriptions of real places does not mean that the events alleged to have happened at those places actually happened. It is normal for fictional narratives to occur in real places with real people.
So that I could go further with the resurrection, but also so I could demonstrate the deity of Christ.
Good luck with that one.
Good. I like these. For everything else, I have chick tracks.
Oh my fucking god. Right, okay, let's scrub this. I'm not going to have any more mention of this. Good god, these guys are bullshit. Grief. Jesus Christ.
If you can't win them with arguments and your winsome approach, I mean, terrify them.
I so hope they were joking there. I really, really do. These guys are more intelligent than to make that comment seriously. But anyway, if you want a quote to take out of context, there's a perfect one. Have fun.
Back to the arguments. So, the Kalam argument. Here's the context. My audience for this podcast is those who are asking me for advice on what would be useful for them to learn. And I'm also thinking from the perspective of conversations I'm having with people or trying to win them to Christ and maybe objections they're having. And we'll spell it out just for the sake of the listener. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause.
Links 3 and 4 for detail on the Kalam.
Obviously, we're just using that as a point of bringing the listener to think about, well, what is the nature of that cause? You know, what could cause everything to come into existence? I think that's a good...
Key point here is that the Kalam cosmological argument does not tell you anything about any cause. Apologists are required to add detail to the argument in order to get to anything resembling what the cause could be. Also, if you do watch the video at 4, you will see that talking about the beginning of the universe is itself problematic. One reason is that having a beginning, and therefore a cause, is something that requires temporal existence. But time, as we know it, exists only within the universe. Time exists because the universe exists, so anything that talks about the universe beginning to exist is using inappropriate language due to the nature of time and our experience of it. Thus the Kalam has faulty premises. Do not be deceived by it.
Lead into conversations, you know?
I recently had a conversation with one of my dearest friends, and he said, you know, there are times where I'm thinking and I keep going back to that idea that the universe exploded into existence at some point in the finite past.
This is exactly what I was referring to. Thinking about the universe beginning at some point in the past is a classic mistake. Yes, it is an understandable mistake, but it is still a mistake. So to use this wrong-headed thinking to convince yourself that a God exists is to layer ignorance on top of more ignorance. Take a break and go and read what the scientists who actually study this material say. You'll find that they don't say the things that the apologists say they say. Remember, the goal of the apologist is to get to a specific conclusion, and they will twist and misrepresent in order to achieve that. Do not take the apologist's word on things like the beginning of the universe. They are not the experts.
This is what he said. That makes me think that this just might be real.
Bullshit premises lead to bullshit conclusions.
And we talked about how the cause could not have been from within the natural order because nature itself didn't exist prior.
See what I mean? Apparently nature only exists within this universe. Anything beyond that cannot be natural. And that is how the apologist crowbars in their God definition. They use inappropriate language and completely ignore what cosmologists are saying about how the present state of the universe came to be.
So we can conclude that the cause is outside of nature, which is the very definition of supernatural.
Having completely bollocksed up what the cosmologists actually say about how the universe came to be, they now have a great foundation onto which to build more bollocks about how they squeeze their God into the equation.
This cause, whatever it is, has to be spaceless, because there was no space, timeless, because there was no time, immaterial, because there was no matter, supernatural, and inconceivably powerful, because it was able to bring the whole universe into existence from that initial singularity.
In summary, they don't know how it could have happened, therefore God did it.
Yes.
Nice of you to admit it. Anyway, moving on.
I chose a moral argument, and if I had to suggest one, every law has a lawgiver. There's a moral law, therefore there's a moral lawgiver.
See links at 7 for info on moral law arguments. When considering the moral law argument, be careful to avoid mistaking the use of the word law in this context with how law is used in a scientific context. I suspect that apologists are banking on this ambiguity to create confusion, to convince their targets that there really is such a thing as a measurable moral law. There isn't. Further confusion is generated by appealing to emotions such as guilt to promote the idea of objective morality, as if it's the same thing as a moral law. If morality really was objective, then there would be a way of measuring that objectively. But there isn't. If the Bible really was clearer about what moral law says, then there would be an easy way of validating what it says. But there isn't. Apologists who push this argument are using gaslighting tactics to bully you into compliance. This is why evangelical Christianity should be considered a cult. And of course, because the claim of a moral law is shaky at best, it is a weak foundation on which to claim a God exists.
That is a great argument to start with. I can tell you that's my wife's favorite version of the moral argument, and she's used it in conversation several times and had a lot of success with it. I have two versions. One is shoots for simplicity as well, like as you're talking about. And then another one is a little bit more advanced. And I didn't want to not include this because of what you're saying. You know, you said at the top of the podcast, yeah, we want to stick with simplicity, but at the same time, if somebody wants to dig deeper, I want them to have some tools as well, which is what we're trying to provide. The first form I like is something along the lines of this. If moral facts exist, God is the best explanation. Moral facts exist, therefore God is the best explanation.
Asserting that moral facts exist helps no one. What we need here is an example of a moral fact and how it can be objectively identified as a fact. Like with the usage of law in moral law, apologists will use the word fact to assert moral objectivity. The tactic I always use here is to ask for the testable methodology so that I can replicate the validation process for finding a moral fact. The response will typically be to distance what they are trying to say from a verifiable scientific methodology. Use this to remind them that without a validation process, they are really asserting an opinion, not a fact.
And the reason I like that argument is just because it focuses on the question of what is the best explanation of moral facts, meaning that there are things that are truly right, there are things that are truly wrong. What is the best explanation of that?
This is Christian apologetics at its very worst. Assert God as a solution to a problem before actually establishing that the problem exists. Push back hard on the claim that moral facts exist. Remind them that without a reliable verification methodology, there is no way to confirm that what they are saying is accurate. Apologists are so used to pushing these arguments without challenge that a strong pushback on their base assumptions tends to unsettle the argument.
All right, so my third argument is a design argument. Every design has a designer. The universe is designed. Therefore, the universe has a designer.
This is the same basic tactic as the moral law one. assert that everything is designed and declare that the designer must therefore be God. And like the moral law argument, no effort is made to objectively test for the universe being designed. You're expected to accept it, based on various other arguments that boil down to they don't know how, therefore their God did it. You may as well invoke a magical fairy as a designer. The result is the same.
Personally, I like the simplicity of this. You know, you can kind of pick what you want to talk about as far as showing examples of design.
And now would be a perfect opportunity to show some examples of design, but not just assert your opinion that they're designed, actually show how you can know that they are designed.
If every design needs a designer, it's a good argument.
Only if you can demonstrate design, which has not been done.
There are numerous arguments that you can pick from to argue for that second premise.
Notice that in support of the universe being designed, they are referring to arguments, but the universe being designed should be a scientific argument, not a philosophical argument. And if it's going to be scientific, you need actual evidence from a repeatable scientific methodology in order to establish the fact that you're claiming. But they don't do that. They're deferring to arguments. So their position that the universe is designed is purely philosophical, based on their religious presuppositions. It is not scientific.
The rest of my case is cumulative. In other words, the arguments build upon one another. So the Kalam tells us something about the cause, the fine-tuning tells us something about the cause, and then the moral argument tells us something about the cause.
Cumulative arguments are all well and good, but when each one individually has only a very tiny chance of success, then adding them all together, or even multiplying them all together, still ends up with a very small number. So the cumulative case here is still really tiny, really insignificant, and deeply unimpressive.
We know that from the very beginning, these initial constants that enable the universe to sustain life, for example, the force of gravity, were present, meaning that from the first moment the universe came into existence, it was programmed.
This is utterly garbled, and not at all how a scientist would describe the initial conditions of the universe. What's being referred to here is the fine-tuning argument, which is a form of design argument, and it essentially asserts that the essential elements of the universe, like gravity, are set to be specific values, and that only those specific values can lead to life. And since each of those values could potentially have been anything, the chances of those values being exactly what they are is so infinitesimally small they could not have happened naturally. Therefore, the Christian God must have done it. See links at 8 for more detail, including an explanation of why the argument is bunk. One thing that the argument overlooks is that the values it is referring to are not arbitrary. The strength of gravity is related to the mass of the object, and that is dictated by basic physics. Subatomic particles, like the Higgs boson, play an important part in this. If the strength of gravity changes, so does the speed of light. These properties are interrelated, arguing that in a natural universe these values had an equal chance of being any other value is dishonest apologetics.
The fine-tuning of the universe is either due to physical necessity, chance, or design. It is not due to physical necessity or chance, therefore it is due to design.
We don't know that it isn't necessity or chance, but apologists will assert this, because they want to give their preferred God conclusion an air of authoritativeness. This is why they love arguments, and why I still ask them to present their methodology for rejecting the other options.
Number 4, an argument for the resurrection. There are many different ways you could formulate an argument for the resurrection. You do have to be familiar with facts surrounding the historical events. Things like the empty tomb.
We don't know it was empty.
Jesus' appearances.
We don't know if they actually happened as described.
So you can start to build a picture for your conversation partner about what was going on, and they can be a witness to those events. And if they have issues with whether or not those things really happened,
and you should have issues,
maybe you can go down those roads as needed. But as long as they're open to talking about a picture of what happened after Jesus was crucified and put in that tomb, and what happened after the fact, and what accounts for that, then you can start to argue. You think the best explanation for everything that we know about that situation is that Jesus rose from the dead because God raised him from the dead.
Evolved narrative fiction will always be a better explanation than the supernatural one, because we know that evolved fiction already happens.
And look at the context for everything he said and did prior to that, all the prophecies leading up to that, and how Christianity performed, so to speak, after the fact in such a hostile environment.
An environment that had multiple religious sects. One was always going to bubble to the top. That's how humanity works.
That's sort of the approach I would suggest people take. And there's lots of different books you could glean a lot from.
And every single one of those books starts from the assumption that what the gospel narratives say is true. They don't take an historical critical paintbrush and apply it to those gospel narratives. They just assume those people are telling the truth and then start from there. That is the basic fundamental mistake that Christian apologetics makes.
I like to present a case for the resurrection that is a set of facts that are highly evidenced.
In other words, they just believe what the Gospels say. And then they call it evidence.
And so I like to use an acronym that I got from Abdu Murray. It's not original to me, but it's CASE.
Because we know all good scientists and historians use acronyms in order to establish the facts with which they are reporting on. Yeah, I'll just skip this bit and move on.
What were they gaining by making this up?
See, they're still working on this assumption that what the Gospels say is actually true. It might not even have been the disciples that made all of this up. Remember, the Gospels were written decades later, possibly even after some of these people were dead, written by other people. Those are the likely people who made stuff up, not the apostles or the disciples.
I want to say that I think that argument is a great elevator pitch. I think it's a great place to start to make a case for the resurrection and to talk about the best explanation for those highly evidenced facts.
Not facts.
But I would never want to stop there. And I think that's where this debate between, should we use minimal facts? Should we use maximal facts?
Not facts.
I think one can easily lead into the other. And I can even say, well, hey, we've got this set of facts.
Not facts.
And a large group of skeptics would grant these. And of course, I don't agree with their conclusions, but hey, let's just start with these and see where we can get. Now let me tell you why I think the New Testament is reliable.
See link at 6 for why it's not.
My fifth argument is making or having your own argument for the reliability of the New Testament.
Making your own argument, eh? Interesting concept. Is that because there isn't one around at all? Or is that because evidence is in short supply? Anyway, let's see what they say.
So here's one that I kind of think is a scaled down version, a 4-point version, and you can find that by J. Warner Wallace.
Ugh.
But he makes 4 points. They were written early.
Decades later.
They're corroborated.
Which details? By what? And by whom?
They haven't changed over time.
Ending of Mark? Anybody?
And they're not biased.
Really?
The idea is to have some reasons to talk about when it comes to the reliability of the New Testament. Why should we believe anything that we read in the Gospels?
Yes. Why should we believe anything written by unknown individuals, written many decades after the events they're alleged to portray, and subjected to unknown numbers of edits and translations?
I'll also link to a great article by Frank Turek, on Frank Turek's website, and it's called 12 Reasons to Trust the New Testament.
Link 9 in the show notes if you're interested.
So he says there's multiple independent sources contributed to it.
Do we really know that they're fully independent, though?
We have thousands of New Testament manuscripts.
Thousands of copies of a small number of originals. This is the technical point here. Thousands of copies, not thousands of individual items.
The manuscripts were written early.
This is contestable. And another point is the earliest complete copies that we have are around about 200 or even more years later.
Documents are a collection of eyewitness accounts.
This is also highly contestable because we don't even know who the real authors of these documents are. Just because they're given the names of apostles doesn't mean they are the people who wrote them.
Non-Christian sources confirm the most important details.
Non-Christian sources might report on some of these details, but it doesn't mean they actually confirm them. They're just repeating things that are in legend at the time.
We can reconstruct it using just quotes of early church fathers.
Can you really? Has anyone actually done it?
Historical and archaeological evidence corroborate it.
Corroborate what exactly? The name of a town? Location of a pool? Yeah, sure, real places might exist. But how do you corroborate miracles using this?
Fulfills ancient prophecies in amazing ways.
Retrospective application and interpretation really don't impress me much.
Contains embarrassing details.
So does Harry Potter.
Includes the different sayings of Jesus.
Did he even say those things? How could we possibly know?
The chain of custody confirms the contents of the original.
Well, that's a big leap. Chain of custody could just as easily identify who it is who made the edits.
It contains undesigned coincidences that verify its authenticity.
Ah, yes, that old chestnut. Really should do an episode just on that one. Retrospectively looking at tiny details and calling them undesigned coincidences, well, maybe somebody's done that with other fictional stories as well.
And the New Testament verifies the Old Testament.
There's that retrospective application again.
That was one of the ones that kept making my list, and I kept removing because I was trying to stick to 5. But if I could add another one, that's definitely the next step in kind of my cumulative thinking would be like, okay, now we're going to make a even broader picture for more and bring in more data after showing, okay, now that we've given good grounds to believe that Jesus rose from the dead.
Except you haven't established that. At best, you've established areas around the life of Jesus and places that existed and maybe things that Jesus did. But that doesn't get you to him rising from the dead. You need more. And what you've provided has not done that.
Now we're going to kind of broaden our scope to find out more of who he is by arguing for the reliability of the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, too, I have to fit in my religious pluralism argument, right? Against religious pluralism.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this would be the first, and again, this is person relative. I might be talking to somebody who obviously thinks that they all can't be true or equally valid or something. But again, in my experience and talking to people, that's the general attitude of, wow, how can you really say one is valid and another's not? Isn't it just based on beliefs? Kind of like they almost think it seems like it would be the same as saying, vanilla is objectively better than chocolate.
Well, that's an odd analogy.
The way that I kind of help people think about this and begin to move from the picture of, okay, which one is preferred, to actually move to the starting to ask the question, which one, if any, is true, is first of all, I point out that they're different.
Sure, they're different. But how do you get from difference to which one is true? I suggest evidence. Let's see what he says.
They differ on almost every significant fact.
Yes, and?
It can't be that they're all equally valid or they're equally true because they contradict.
Sure. So maybe they're all wrong?
It's logically impossible that they all are true or equally valid.
Agreed, but it is logically possible that they are all equally wrong.
And so, of course, then we need to begin the hard work of saying, well, which one makes claims that are true or most correlate with reality?
None of them?
And that, of course, is where the Kalam and the fine-tuning and the moral argument and the resurrection argument and the reliability of the New Testament are very helpful.
Well, they're certainly helpful in justifying positions that you already believe. That is true.
Right. Well, I'm interested in knowing if this has been helpful for our listeners.
Well, I guess it's been helpful in confirming that Christians really will use arguments to help bolster up pre-existing beliefs. But then I guess I kind of knew that already. Beyond that, not really. You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.